Louise Steinman, and I have the great joy of being the curator of the Allowed series and the program director for the Library Foundation. And I am thrilled to welcome tonight's speaker, V.S. Ramachandran, to Allowed and to the Los Angeles Public Library for the first time. It's long been a dream that he would come here. V.S. Ramachandran has been dubbed the Marco Polo of neuroscience by Richard Dawkins, and it's an apt comparison because V.S. Ramachandran is a great explorer in his field. But I also wonder, was Marco Polo very funny? Because Ramachandran's new book, The Telltale Brain, tackles the most exciting and controversial topics in neurology today, and he does so with a storyteller's eye and a comedian's timing and wit. It's just a really delightful book. His investigations into phantom limb pain, synesthesia, and other brain disorders allow him to explore and to begin to answer the most basic philosophical questions about the nature of self and human consciousness. V.S. Ramachandran is the director of the Center for Brain and Cognition and a professor with the Psychology Department and Neurosciences program at the University of California, San Diego, and as well an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute in La Jolla. He's the author of Phantoms in the Brain, A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness, and Man with a Phantom Twin, Adventures in the Neuroscience of the Human Brain. He's the recipient of many awards and honors. I won't even list them all. And he will be signing tonight The Telltale Brain after the program tonight. After his talk, Margaret Wertheim, who's a noted science writer and the author of books on the cultural history of physics, including Pythagoras' Trousers, A History of the Relationship Between Physics and Religion, and The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, A History of Space from Dante to the Internet. In 2003, she co-founded the Institute for Figuring, an organization based in Los Angeles that promotes the public understanding of the poetic and aesthetic dimensions of science and mathematics. The aesthetics of neurology and the aesthetics in general are something that Dr. Ramachandran covers in this book. So get ready with your great questions, and now please join me in welcoming V.S. Ramachandran to the Los Angeles Public Library. Thank you.
Now, it's almost a cliche to say that the brain is the most complexly organized form of matter, at least complexly organized form of matter known to us human beings. And to gain some appreciation of this, all you have to do is to look at numbers. As you know, the brain is made up of cells like any other organ in the body, made up of specialized cells called neurons. And I don't want to keep laboring the obvious, but just for people here who are not familiar with this, there are 100 billion such neurons, which is the structural and functional units of the nervous system. And each neuron contacts other neurons at points called synapses, something like 1,000 to 10,000 synapses between neurons. And each synapse can be inhibitory or excitatory, can be on or off. And based on this, somebody has computed that the number of possible brain states, permutations and combinations of brain activity, exceeds the number of elementary particles in the known universe. And just to get a sense of perspective on this, think of what's involved here, as I say in my book in the very beginning. Here's this lump of jelly, essentially, which you can hold in the palm of your hand. But this lump of jelly can contemplate the vastness of space, interstellar space. It can contemplate the meaning of infinity, the meaning of zero, the meaning of God. And it can indeed contemplate itself contemplating, what we call introspection or self-awareness. And this is all coming from this mass of jelly, and this truly is the greatest of mysteries. How does it come about? So how does one study the structure and functions of this organ of staggering complexity? There are many new approaches, as you know, brain imaging, which I will not be talking about. There's another technique called single unit neurophysiology, where you put electrodes into single neurons in the brain, eavesdrop on that activity to find out what they're doing. For example, you can put an electrode in the visual centers in the brain, in the back of the brain, and you clap your hand, nothing will happen to the neuron, it won't fire. But if you move a bar of light in front of the person, or monkey or cat, the cell will fire. So then you call it a visual neuron. So you can map different functions by recording from cells or functional brain imaging. The approach we primarily use in our lab is to look at patients who've sustained an injury, either a small stroke or head injury or a tumor, destroying a very small part of the brain, very tiny portion of the brain, causing a lesion. What you then see is not a general blunting of all your cognitive capacities, an across the board reduction in your mental capacity, but often a highly selective loss of one specific function, with other functions being preserved intact. So this gives you some confidence in asserting that that region of the brain is somehow involved in mediating that function. So we're going to look at many examples of this in the next 20 minutes or half an hour. And one of my favorite examples is, let's talk about the Capgras delusion, which I think how many of you have read my previous book? Raise your hands, because I don't want to, okay, fortunately only a minority here. So that shows you the picture of the brain seen in lateral view. So that's I'm sorry this light's so tiny, but that's the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and tucked away in the inner surface of the temporal lobe is a structure called the fusiform gyrus, about the size of my pinky. And if the fusiform gyrus is damaged on both sides of the brain, you get a condition called face blindness. This person can no longer look at somebody and recognize this person. Even his own mother or father or boyfriend or fiancé or wife or husband, even people who are well known to him, he can no longer recognize them. Now, there's nothing wrong with his eyesight or his vision, because he can still read a newspaper. He can name the color of an object. His main problem, in fact, you can show him a face and ask him to match it with his multiple choice of different faces, and he'll do so accurately. So you can even see the features of the face and match it accurately with the model. What eludes him is the identity of the face. Who is this person, right? And yet his memory is normal. You can read a paragraph of text to him, come back after an hour and say, what did I read to you? And he'll tell you what you read to him. So his memory is fine. His only problem is recognizing faces. So I think we are justified in deducing that the fusiform gyrus is somehow specialized for recognizing faces. Now this is well known, but there's another disorder we have studied which is so rare that even most neurologists have not heard of it. That's called Capgras delusion. And that happens, I saw a case not long ago who was described in my book. The Capgras delusion refers to a patient. For example, this patient was a student of mine who had suffered who was in a car accident, had a head injury, was in coma for 2 weeks. Am I speaking too fast? Okay. So he comes out of the coma, he seems slightly disoriented, has mild dysarthria, difficulty talking, but other than that he's fine. He's wide awake, he talks normally, other than the minor speech impediment. His memory is normal, he's emotionally normal, he's not hysterical or confused. Everything seems, his IQ is normal. But he has and he can read a book, his eyesight is normal, right? But one profound delusion. Unlike the prosopagnosis, the face blind person, he can look at somebody and say, that looks like my mother, that looks like my father. But he says, this woman, doctor, she looks exactly like my mother, but she's an imposter. She's not my mother, she's some other woman pretending to be my mother. This is called a Capgras delusion. Sometimes it affects the father, and sometimes other close people like siblings or parents, but very often the mother. I don't know quite why, but very often the mother. So what causes the Capgras delusion? Here's somebody who's perfectly sane. This is going to be true of all the syndromes I'm going to talk about. The important point is the selective nature of the delusion or the malady you're considering, the syndrome. Everything else is intact. The person is not crazy. That's very important. Okay? So here's a chap who's obviously mentally normal, stable, not emotionally disturbed, can read, talk fluently, understands what you're saying. Everything is, when you play chess with him, discuss politics with him, everything is normal. But he looks at his mother, he becomes flagrantly delusional and says, this woman is an imposter, she's not my mother. She looks just like my mother. So what's the standard explanation? If you go and look at old textbooks of psychiatry, what they'll tell you is they come up with a Freudian explanation. And that is, this chap, when he was a little baby, same argument applies to a woman, by the way, but I'll just talk about guys just to keep it simple. When this guy was a little baby, he was very attracted sexually to his mother, so-called Oedipus complex. I'm not saying I believe this, but that's the sort of Freudian view. Then as the child grows up, the cortex develops and represses or inhibits these latent sexual urges, limbic urges. Thank God, otherwise we'd all be sexually turned on when you look at your mother. Okay? Now along comes a blow to the head, bang, damaging the cortex, removes his inhibition, and these latent sexual urges towards your mother, these irritable urges, come flaming to the surface. Suddenly and inexplicably you find yourself being turned on sexually by your mother. Therefore you say, my God, this is my mom, how come I'm being sexually turned on? This must be an imposter. The same seems strange to us, but it's the only interpretation maybe that makes sense to that chap with this problem, right, with his irritable urges. Now this didn't make any sense to me. It's a very ingenious theory, like most Freudian theories are. But it didn't make any sense to me because I subsequently saw a patient where the patient has the same delusion, the Capgras delusion, not about his mother, but about his pet dog, his pet poodle. And he says, doctor, this looks just like Fifi, but in fact is a different dog. Now you try applying the Freudian. You have to talk about the latent bestiality in all humans or some such rubbish, right? So I started thinking in terms of the brain anatomy, and when visual signals, when you or any one of us here sees a face or a table or a chair or a tiger or a lion or your dean or something, messages goes to the visual centers in the brain. The messages are analyzed into shapes and squiggles and all of that, the lines that compose the visual image. And then eventually they're recognized in the fusiform gyrus, where you recognize objects, faces, as this face looks like my mother, or this face looks like a pig, or this face looks like whatever. This is a table, this is a chair. That happens in the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe, which I already mentioned was where faces are encoded. When it's damaged, you become face blind. But remember, this chap is not face blind. He says it looks like my mother, it looks like my father, so on and so forth. So fusiform gyrus in this chap is okay. The messages go to the fusiform gyrus. From the fusiform gyrus, in all of us here, the messages go to a structure called the amygdala, which is the gateway to the emotional centers in the brain, which performs an emotional surveillance of the world, of the things you're looking at. Is this something to watch out for? My God, it's a tiger. My God, it's a lion. Run away. Or it's a mate, potential mate. Pursue it, right? Something like that. That's what the amygdala is doing. It's alerting you to the emotional impact of what you're looking at, and also to the finer emotional nuances of whatever you're looking at. And then what it does is it sends messages to other parts of the brain so you experience the emotions appropriate. And then it sends messages down the autonomic nervous system, cascading down the hypothalamic nuclei down the autonomic nervous system, which makes your heart beat faster and blood pressure goes up, and preparing your body for the ensuing action, for fighting, fleeing, or sexual behavior, right? So it prepares your body for action, therefore your heart starts pumping more blood, your blood pressure goes up, and you start sweating, right? And this is to dissipate the anticipated heat you're going to produce as a result of muscular exertion. Now, this is fortunate for us because you can put 2 electrodes in the skin and measure the sweating, change in skin resistance, called the galvanic skin resistance, or skin conduction, GSR, galvanic skin response. This gives you some idea of the emotional response to whatever you're looking at. Now, you could say, why not just ask the guy, are you being turned on? The problem with that is there are many layers in your brain of recognition, and it could be that you're turned on, but something else kicks in and says, don't tell this guy. So there are many layers of processing going on. And you want to get to the gut level emotional response, you measure the galvanic skin response. Okay. Now, our hypothesis was in this chap, the fusiform gyrus is normal, visual areas are normal, so he's able to recognize his mother. But the wire that goes from there to the amygdala has been cut by the accident. So he looks at his mother, but there is no warm glow or terror, as the case may be, when he sees his mother. And therefore, he says, if this is my mother, how come I'm not experiencing any warmth or any emotion here? This can't possibly be my mother. Must be some other strange woman. Again, given that peculiar disconnection in his brain, it's the only thing, bizarre interpretation, delusion that makes sense to him with his deranged connections. Although to you and me, it looks completely bizarre. Right? Now, how do you test this? You can do a very simple experiment. In a normal person, any one of you here, bring you here, put 2 electrodes on your skin, on your palm, show you different pictures. I show you a picture of a table or a chair, you're not going to show any reaction. I show you a picture of an umbrella, no reaction. A shoe, no reaction. Unless you have a shoe fetish, it's a different matter. But normally you don't have any reaction. Similarly, if I show you pictures of strangers, now I'm talking about normal people here, no sweating, no reaction. But if I show you a picture of your mother, all of you here, you don't even have to be Jewish. You get a huge jolt in your galvanic skin response. You start sweating immediately, right? Now, what about this chap? You show him pictures of tables and chairs and umbrellas and shoes, there's no response. You show him pictures of strangers, there's no response. All that is normal. But you show him a picture of his mother, there's no galvanic skin response, supporting our idea that there's been a disconnection, right? Now, when I first discovered this, along with my colleague Bill Herstein, we published it. And of course, the immediate reaction we often hear is, well, that's just one case. Now, there's a big tension in the field between people who mainly study single cases, like Oliver Sacks is a good example, but do experiments on these patients and draw conclusions, and people who do a statistical analysis on a large number of patients. And you need both kinds of research, obviously. And the obvious answer to this, you make a discovery on one case and then you confirm it on additional patients. And my usual way I present this to my students is, supposing I bring a pig to the audience here now, I bring a pig to the podium, and I say, this pig can talk. And you say, really? And I wave my wand and it starts talking. what would your reaction be? Oh, just show me another pig. You're not going to do that. You're going to say, my God, it's talking, right? And that's what my colleagues do. They'll say, show me another pig, right? So when we saw this in this patient saying his mother is an imposter, we knew that this explanation was correct. Subsequently, it's been confirmed on dozens and dozens of patients. So we know that this is essentially on the right track. The reason I mentioned this and took so much time explaining this is that it's a good example of cognitive neuroscience in action, of how you can take a person with a completely bizarre, incomprehensible neuropsychiatric disorder, claiming that his mother is an imposter, and then come up with a reasonable explanation of what's going on, and then do a simple experiment that takes 1 hour to do and show that the explanation is correct. Even more bizarre is when David's mother goes to the next room and phones him after half an hour. He picks up the phone, and she says, David? He says, Mom, where are you? How are you? It's been ages since we met. Where have you been? Then she hangs up, comes back after half an hour, and he says, who are you? You look just like my mother. Okay. Now, why does that happen? Because there's a separate wire that goes from the superior temporal gyrus, from the auditory cortex. I'm sorry, this is not working too well, but at the top of the temporal lobes, the auditory cortex there, down to the amygdala. There's a separate wire from the auditory centers to the emotion centers. This has not been cut by the accident. So when he listens to the voice on the phone, he becomes completely normal. He's not delusional. When he sees her in person, he goes to the visual centers. His wire is gone, so he becomes frankly delusional. So it's a lovely example of how you can, even the intricate aspects of the disorder, you can explain in terms of the known neuroanatomy. Let me give you another example. And that is, you know we have studied phantom limbs extensively. A person with an arm amputated vividly feels the presence of that missing arm. It's called a phantom limb. Sometimes the phantom limb is painfully frozen in an awkward position. We used a trick using a mirror and a $5 mirror put in front of the patient, animated the phantom, made the pain go away. But I'm not going to talk about that because it's all there in the book. It's also there in my previous book. But there's another syndrome which nobody's heard of, or very few people have heard of, not phantom limbs, another syndrome which is quite rare but not that rare, called apotemnophilia. This refers to people who are otherwise completely normal, have held a normal job, are not emotionally disturbed, are intelligent, there's nothing wrong with them neurologically or they're psychiatrically normal, but they want their arm amputated. They want their own arm or leg amputated, and they've had this lifelong desire from childhood to have their arm amputated. About half of them go and get it amputated. It's not legal in this country, but they go to Mexico or Canada and get it amputated there. And very often, having done that, they feel happy and their depression goes away. Right? So now the ethics of this is dubious. I don't know. I mean, we can take it up during discussions, but I'm interested in it from the point of view of understanding the brain, not the ethical questions that arise. So okay, so what would happen? Why does this happen? Well, people thought they were crazy, as usual. So they would go and see psychiatrists. Psychiatrists would come up with Freudian explanations for why these people want their arm amputated. One theory that's been proposed holds that they want their arm amputated to gain attention. They want to draw attention to themselves. I mean, this is bullshit, right? I mean, why not amputate the nose or the ear? Why not amputate the ear to get attention? And why something drastic like having the arm removed? Another theory that's been around is they want to amputate this because they want a big stump that resembles a large penis. Okay? I mean, I'm not making this up. You can go Google this. This is actually, they're published in the literature. So we came up with an explanation in terms of the anatomy of the brain. Sensory signals from this is in my book, by the way. Sensory signals from the skin, muscles, and indeed from vision, all these sensory signals, but I'm sorry, not vision, but muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joints, all of this goes to this vertical strip of cortex called S1. Actually, I take that back. It's the touch signals go to S1, but the signals about joint sense and muscle sense and all of that goes to S2 right here. So this is where the sensory maps of the body surface and the arms and the legs in the brain. But that's not the body image area. That's just the sensory map. Just behind that, over here, is a structure called the superior parietal lobule, especially in the right hemisphere. The right superior parietal lobule contains what you call the body image. So when I close my eyes and I do this, I have a vivid, sort of dynamic, vibrant image of all my body parts. And I can even look at them and all of that. That image of your body, the internal representation of your body image, which we think is probably deranged in conditions like anorexia, for example, that's located not in this hemisphere, but in the other hemisphere, but roughly in that region. Sorry, this is not working again. That region there, superior parietal lobule. And this we know is genetically laid down. A scaffolding for your body image is there already specified by genes. Now imagine what would happen if in that body image the arm is missing because of some gene mutation, something's gone awry in the embryo that is missing. So that is going to create this acute discrepancy. The sensory signals are all coming in. This area is normal. The sensory areas are normal, representing the arm and hand and all of that, right? And we have now done brain imaging experiments to confirm this theory and shown that it's correct, right? So the sensory representation of the arm is normal. But there is nowhere for that sensory signal to go to because the body image center is missing the arm, right? So this creates an acute state of tension. If you ask them what's going on, they'll say, doctor, I'm not able to explain this. The arm is there. And I said, does it feel alien? Does it feel like it doesn't belong to you? He said, no, it feels like it's intrusive. It sort of belongs to me too much. It wants to assert itself. And it doesn't make any sense to you and me because we've got normal brains, most of us, right? So this doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? It's constantly over-present and it's intrusive. And I want to get rid of it. I know if I get rid of it, I'll be happy. I'll be much more complete as a person. It sounds bizarre, but if you look at the anatomy, that discrepancy would precisely predict this kind of discrepancy. That's why they get their arm amputated, and then they're happy, because there's no longer this discrepancy. And we did brain imaging experiments and showed, in fact, sensory areas are normal, hand is represented there. If you touch the hand, that area gets activated, but the area in the body image center, the hand is not represented. So this is still early days. We only tested half a dozen patients, but we think it's correct, essentially. So there's two examples of, so this is what we do mainly, is to look at cases, some of them are well known, like phantom limb syndrome. Others are rare, like Capgras syndrome or apotemnophilia, which have largely been brushed under the carpet by the mainstream neurology, neuroscience establishment because they don't fit the big picture. It's what Thomas Kuhn calls an anomaly. So this is, if something doesn't fit the big picture, what do you mean when somebody says, this arm, I want this arm removed, or says my mother is an imposter? What you do is you engage in a kind of denial, which is very common among my colleagues. You push it under the carpet and pretend it doesn't exist, right? Now the great thing about science is sometimes you develop a nose for anomalies. You actually pursue these oddities. 90% of the time they're false alarms. You're wasting your time. But every now and then you hit the jackpot, and it's not a waste of time. It's a gold mine. And an example would be apotemnophilia, Capgras syndrome, phantom limb syndrome, and many others. Let me tell you about one other syndrome, and then I'll start closing down. So when did we begin? You got another 15 minutes, correct? 10 or 15 minutes, okay, that's good. I'm trying to go at lightning speed here. So how do I advance here? Okay. I'd now like to switch gears. I've told you a little bit about phantom limbs, and not a lot. I've told you about apotemnophilia. Let me tell you about another extraordinary observation which is described in the book. Oops, I can't go backwards here, unfortunately. An observation we made on a patient with a phantom limb. Phantom limbs have been known since antiquity, but described over 100 years ago in a scientific journal. When an arm or a leg is amputated, you vividly feel the ghostly presence of that arm sort of haunting you. It can be excruciatingly painful. There's a lot of work we did with mirrors and phantom limbs, but I'm not going to repeat all that. But what we observed recently, which is new, is here. Let's assume I'm the patient with a phantom limb. My arm's gone, but I still feel my phantom there. I simply look at you, somebody touching your arm with their hand. Yes, there you go. Just do that. The astonishing thing is, I feel the stroking and the tapping in my phantom limb. See, phantom limbs have been known for 150 years, but nobody had observed this simple thing, that a phantom limb patient will actually experience touch sensations from another human being. Not all of them do, but many of them do. Now, why the hell would this happen? Here is another mystery, right? Why would it happen? Well, it turns out you have to look at a system of neurons recently discovered called mirror neurons. So there are neurons in the front of the brain which will fire every time the monkey makes a movement. These are called motor command neurons. So the monkey does that, reaches for a peanut, one neuron fires, or one set of neurons really. The monkey pulls the lever, another neuron fires. A monkey pushes something, another neuron fires. Monkey puts something in its mouth, another neuron. These are motor command neurons which orchestrate the sequence of muscle twitches required for grabbing the peanut and putting it in the mouth. Okay? So they're orchestrating that sequence, programming that sequence of movements. And this is known for 50 years, discovered by Vernon Mountcastle at Johns Hopkins. But a certain subset of these neurons, about 20% of these neurons, the same neuron which fired when me, the monkey, reached out and grabbed a peanut, the peanut grabbing neuron, also fires when I watch you reach out and grab a peanut. This is quite extraordinary. Another neuron which fired when I pulled a lever will also fire when I watch you pull a lever. So these are called monkey see, monkey do neurons, okay? Or mirror neurons. What they're doing is creating a virtual reality simulation of what you're up to, what's going on in your brain or your mind. So the neuron is saying, hey, she's about to do exactly what I would do when this neuron fires, namely reaching out and grabbing a peanut. Same neuron is firing, therefore she must be about to reach out and grab a peanut. In other words, it's imbuing your behavior with intention. It's inferring what your intention is. It's reading your mind, so they're called mind-reading neurons. Not using telepathy or anything spooky like that, just using the visual input and saying, you're doing that, you're doing the same thing as I would do, same neuron is firing as I would do if I was reaching a peanut, therefore she must be about to reach for a peanut. So the brain is full of these mirror neurons in different locations, okay? So this is important because it's involved in reading people's intentions and all of that. But there are some mirror neurons also for touch. So there are mirror neurons more posteriorly in this region, which I already showed you, the touch region of the brain, which will fire when somebody touches my left thumb or my index finger. And many of these are called sensory touch neurons. And I just already told you about these sensory touch neurons when I was telling you about apotomnophilia. About 10% of them will fire when I watch you being touched in the same location, right? So the neuron is signaling, higher centers are reading this neuron's output and saying, look, something's being done to her, and she's obviously feeling the same thing as would happen to you when your finger is touched. You should feel now, you should empathize with her and recognize that she's feeling the same thing you would feel if this neuron were firing, namely if you were being touched. So I call them empathy neurons or Gandhi neurons, right? Because that's what they're doing. They're engaging in empathy. But the interesting thing is, notice that this neuron, even though it's firing, the same neuron is firing, my touch neuron is firing when I simply watch you being touched. How come then when I watch you being caressed or touched, I don't actually feel the caress, right? I empathize, but I don't actually feel it. I don't get confused between your sensation and my sensation. The reason for that is, it turns out, the receptors in my skin, while I'm watching you being stroked, my mirror neuron is firing, okay? But my skin is informing my brain, sending a null signal saying, look, don't worry, you're not being touched, she's being touched. Or somebody pokes you with a needle, I empathize, but I don't say ouch and feel the pain. It's because my receptors are informing the brain, no, you're not being poked, empathize, but don't feel the pain. Thank God, right? Now, if I remove my arm, there's no feedback coming from my arm saying it's not real, so when I watch you being touched or poked, I feel it in my phantom. Not only that, a patient I saw not long ago had intense pain in the phantom, and she asked, when I showed her this, she was surprised by this, she went and told her husband to massage his own arm when she watched. So she got a phantom massage on her phantom. And that seemed to relieve the pain partially. Now this needs to be tested in rigorous clinical trials, but we've seen strong hints of this in a couple of patients. Last thing, we're running out of time. Let me spend 5 minutes telling you about another syndrome called synesthesia. It's all about mirror neurons. This is discovered by Francis Galton. Oops. Synesthesia is a phenomenon where some otherwise, just stop me when I reach the 30-minute point. Oop. How's this? Can somebody fix this? Oop. That's Francis Galton, the first cousin of Charles Darwin. He noticed that certain people in the population who are otherwise completely normal, certain percentage, he used to think 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, but we now know 1 in 100, no, 1 in 1,000. We now know 1 in 50 people has this condition. Completely normal, but every time they see a number, they see a color. 5 is red, 6 is blue, 7 is green, 8 is yellow, and so on and so forth. Every time they hear a tone, the tone is colored. F sharp is blue, C sharp is green, and so on and so forth. Now, why would this happen? Again, it's described by Galton, I think late 1800s. It's been around for a long time. Hundreds of cases have been described, but people ignored it. It never made it into mainstream neuroscience and neurology. The people say, what the hell do you mean 5 is red? Doesn't make any sense. So it was brushed under the carpet. And there are several standard explanations. One is they're just crazy. Now, one of the things you learn in medicine is, in psychiatry and neurology is, if somebody is saying something that sounds crazy, it usually means you're not smart enough to figure it out. Sometimes he is crazy, but that's a different thing. Second, so maybe that's true, but you can't use that as an explanation. Second idea is maybe they're high on drugs, like LSD and things like that. And sure enough, it's more common in Berkeley than in San Diego. So but anyway, that's neither here nor there. And drugs do enhance synesthesia, that's known. The third argument is more clever, and that is maybe they're being metaphorical. When you say cheddar cheese is sharp, but I'm wearing a loud tie, which I'm not, but you say loud tie, why is it loud? I mean, it doesn't make a sound. Cheese is sharp, but it's not sharp. It's a taste. It's actually soft when you touch it. Why do you call it sharp? And you say, well, its taste is sharp, but there's a circle of reasoning there. Why do you use a tactile adjective to describe a gustatory sensation? So this is what we call an intersensory metaphor. It's one of the things we've studied, by the way. But going back to synesthesia, what causes it? Since we are running out of time, I'm going to go straight to the cause. What we discovered was, well, first of all, we showed that it's a real phenomenon using various experiments, which I won't go into. They're not crazy. Secondly, it turns out that if you look at the brain, a coronal section of the brain in the temporal lobes, go back to this famous fusiform gyrus, which I've been telling you about. There is the there is the color area of the brain, which is right there in the fusiform gyrus. The color area is also there, not just the face area. The color area is also in the fusiform gyrus, in a different part of the fusiform gyrus. The number area of the brain, outlined in red, is right next to it, almost touching it. So we said, what's the likelihood that this bizarre condition of people seeing numbers as colored is the most common form of synesthesia, and these two areas are almost touching each other in the brain? Well, it's unlikely to be a coincidence. They're probably cross-wired in these people for some reason. It runs in families. Galton noticed that. So there's a genetic basis. For some reason, in some people, these two areas, number and color area, get cross-wired. So every time you see a number, you see a corresponding color. Is that clear to everybody? Okay. Now, why would they be cross-wired? Well, it turns out in the fetal brain, everything is connected to everything. There's an excess of connections. And what happens, there are pruning genes that prune away the excess connections to create the modularity that characterizes the normal adult brain, specialized regions. So if this pruning gene mutates, there's defective pruning in the brain, and if it's expressed selectively, the mutated gene expressed selectively in the fusiform gyrus, you're going to get excess connections and cross-wiring between number and color. So every time he sees a number, he sees a color. We tested the theory using brain imaging and showed that this is what happens. These people have cross-wiring. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying there's another puzzle about synesthesia, again known for decades. Synesthesia is 8 times more common among artists, poets, and novelists than in the general population. Now, why would that be? Well, people said it's because artists are crazy. Right? Well, that's not an explanation. Now, let's assume, what are artists, poets, and novelists, all of them, what do they have in common? They're all very good at seeing analogies and metaphor. They can link seemingly unrelated things, like when Shakespeare says, it is the yeast and Juliet is the sun. You don't say, Juliet is the sun, she's a glowing ball of fire. You don't say that. Actually, schizophrenics say that. They take metaphors literally. But most normal people would say, she's radiant like the sun, she's glowing like the sun, she's nurturing like the sun, she's warm like the sun. And all the correct links are made in your brain. So the ability to link seemingly unrelated things is what you call a metaphor, and that's what artsy types are good at. Now, if that same gene, the synesthesia gene, is expressed just in the fusiform in a quirky manner, you get number-color synesthesia. But if it's expressed throughout the brain, if you assume concepts are also located in different parts of the brain, there's a lot of evidence for that, then the excess cross connections between different parts of the brain creates a greater propensity to link different regions, far-flung regions of the brain, creating a propensity towards metaphorical thinking and artistic ability. And that's why we think this gene survived. Usually it's a completely useless gene, like seeing 5 as red, would have been weeded out by natural selection 100,000 years ago. But it's still there in 1 out of 50 people. Why would this useless gene survive? Because it has a hidden agenda. Hidden agenda is it makes some outliers in the population creative, artistic, metaphorical. Right? Then people often ask me at these talks, when I give these talks, well, if it's that good, how come we don't all have it? Well, that's a stupid question because evolution takes time. Given another 100,000 years, maybe we'll all have the synesthesia gene. But the more important reason is you don't want everybody to be creative and metaphorical and things like that. You also need engineers. You need, if there's a neurosurgeon doing surgery on your brain, you don't want him getting metaphorical on you. So you need diversity in the gene pool. You need a diverse spectrum of personalities and abilities. So it's just as well that some people are autistic and many people are not. That's why the gene is not more prevalent than it already is. So let me conclude by saying the book is full of these examples of anomalies in neurology, and what we've done is to try and rescue them from oblivion, bring them into mainstream neuroscience, and argue that these have, first of all, what's causing the syndrome, Secondly, okay, you explain what's causing it, what's wrong in the brain, what's changed in the brain, but so big deal, who cares, right? So we explain synesthesia and we say, why is it important to explain it? Maybe it'll explain creativity, right? You explain phantom limbs, why is that important? But maybe it'll pave the way to a cure, right? So, and lastly, all these questions like what is consciousness, what is the self, what is, how do you recognize faces, what are emotions, how do you fall in love, and what is creativity, what is metaphor? All of this was the province of philosophy until for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and they haven't really made a lot of headway solving these problems, not for the lack of trying, because they've been at it for 3,000 years. But now, studying the brain, doing neuroscience, we can begin to understand how all of this really works. Thank you.
Well, aren't I the lucky one? I think we'd all agree that that was a truly fabulous performance. Really good. I want to start off, Rama, by asking you a question about some of your work that actually relates to my own life. I've been, from the first time I read about your work on mirror neurons, I was completely fascinated. And I think it's an absolutely marvellous idea, in part because it explains to me something that's central to my life, and that is that I'm an identical twin.
Oh.
And growing up as children, my sister and I become very different as adults, but as children, we looked exactly the same. Most people couldn't tell us apart. We dressed alike, we did everything together. And my sense was that she was not another person to me. She was an extension of me. And when I read about mirror neurons, I wondered, is it possible that twins have, in some sense, more mirror neurons?
Well, first of all, let me say that I've not studied that specifically with twins. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, when I said the mirror neurons are involved in empathy, an extreme form of empathy, or hyper-empathy, if you want to call it, they're in a sense dissolving. The only thing, in a sense, the only thing separating you from another human being, separating you from me, preventing me from experiencing your feelings directly, right, is your skin or my skin. So the only true barrier between your brain and my brain is the skin and the air between us. It's not really separate. Because when I'm watching you do something, the same neuron is firing in my brain. So it's like the global Facebook or internet going on already, and I don't know when mirror neurons evolved, probably 100, 200,000 years ago. They're seen in lower primates too. But they just became more sophisticated in humans. So the old Eastern tradition where the people say there's no real barriers between you and me, between one human being and another human being, it's artificial, it's created by language and things like that. This provides some scientific evidence. I don't mean in any literal sense, but at least in a metaphorical sense, it provides some scientific validation of that. Now, whether this would be more true for twins, it might be the case, because in twins, brain structures are also going to be similar. There are minor variations in the mirror neurons from person to person. But between twins, there's going to be less variation. So that might make you couple with your twin. Your brain's more coupled than my brain is coupled with you, for example.
And one of the phenomena that people constantly ask twins about is, can you mind read one another? And the only answer I can give to that question is, in some sense, yes. And again, it occurred to me that mirror neurons could, in a sense, be an explanation for this experience.
I think that if you've grown up with this person, there are a lot of identical mannerisms and things of that nature, and the brains are more similar between you and your twin than, say, between you and me, then the degree of empathy and emotional tuning in and intuitions about what that person is feeling is going to be much more than you would with me. I'm not sure of this, but it's just a hunch. But it depends on what they mean when they say you read your mind. If it's from another room, so it's telepathy or something, that I don't believe in. But if it's in the same room and you're watching the mannerisms and the emotions,
yes,
there's going to be greater tuning in and reciprocity and possibly more intuitive understanding of what that, quote-unquote, reading that person's mind more effectively than I could.
And it leads to a bigger question that affects everybody, which I think is, if twins do have this hyper-developed mirror neuron relationship, which I think my experience would lead me to say they do, is it possible then that generally people can, as it were, your mirror neurons can be exercised so that you could, as it were, develop them to have greater states of empathy or greater feelings of oneness with one another? Do we have any examples of?
I can't think of any obvious examples, but it stands to reason that that would be true, that like any other neural system, it could be exercised in some ways. Maybe there are neurotransmitters that are specific to mirror neurons which you could enhance pharmacologically in some way. People say E, for example, I don't know, but people say E, for example, is maybe a transmitter that increases empathy. It's an empathogen. And maybe it's acting on some mirror neuron-like system. We proposed this in an article in Scientific American some years ago, and I got a lot of email about it.
Right.
So it's entirely possible that that's the case. I'm sorry, I'm losing track of your original question, which was...
Well, basically,
Oh, yeah.
Is it possible that, is it possible that people's empathy for one another could be enhanced by
Yes.
doing, in some sense, mental exercises that would enhance the effect of mirror neurons, which in some sense seems to me what's happened to twins.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that in theory one can, but exactly how to do it we don't know yet. One can also do pharmacological enhancement, as I said. But again, we have to be careful exactly what you're doing and what substance you're using. But another point we have made in the book is about autism being primarily a mirror neuron deficit. Now, the evidence on this is still ambiguous. Some groups claiming it is, some groups claiming nay, right? But if that's true, then one way of restoring the empathy in especially high-functioning autistic people, restoring the empathy would be to exercise the mirror neurons. If you can find some way of doing this. Maybe force them to do a lot of imitation, force them to look at multiple reflections in a mirror, things of that nature. And that might very well enhance their ability to imitate. That might spill over in their ability to empathize. So mirror neurons are not just required for emotional empathy, but also for imitation, sophisticated imitation. This is why I think humans are especially good at imitation. And so if you think imitation is some trivial ability, you say aping somebody, and you think it's actually derogatory, insulting somebody to imitate them, mocking them, you say. But in fact, it's of fundamental importance for culture, because by imitation, skills are passed on from parent to offspring or horizontally to your peers. So for example, a polar bear took hundreds of generations and 100,000 years, maybe, to evolve a fur coat through the painful, laborious process of natural selection. But a human child, an early ancestral hominid, watching a mother skin a polar bear, attack, kill, hunt down a polar bear and skin it and wear the coat, watching the polar bear, using its mirror neuron system, engaging the mirror neuron system, can imitate this after just 2 or 3 times watching the mother doing this. So similarly, in one of a kind invention, like the discovery of fire, which one especially smart Homo erectus discovered, or early Homo sapiens discovered, or one of a kind discovery of any kind that one particular smart one discovered, or through accident one of them discovered, which would have immediately died out without the mirror neuron system, would have spread very, very quickly through the population and communicated to offspring very quickly through imitation learning. So what was Darwinian became Lamarckian evolution. And hence the dawn of culture, dawn of civilization. So here's the set of neurons. It's evolved to the point that set in motion the whole process of what we call culture and civilization. It's ascribing a lot to these neurons. So I want to emphasize it's not just mirror neurons doing everything, but it's connection. But there is a lot of media hype surrounding mirror neurons. It's important to emphasize they're not doing everything, but they are very fascinating.
And one of your interesting claims is that this may be the explanation for autism, that a deficit of these neurons.
Correct.
And so many things have been proposed as the explanations for autism. Personally, of all of the explanations I've read, I like the mirror neuron one, seems to make sense to me, but it does have a logical problem about it that I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
If a deficit of mirror neurons or functioning of mirror neurons is what is behind autism, why does it appear to be increasing? Or are you one of the people who thinks it isn't actually increasing? Well,
I'm sort of agnostic about that, but there's two issues here. What is the brain change that's causing the symptoms that characterize autism? And we're claiming there's a beautiful match between all the properties. Make a list, a tabular column of all the properties of mirror neurons. Imitation, emulation, emotional empathy, some aspects of language, and then make a list of all the things that are deficient in autism, such as pretend play. The autistic children don't do pretend play, which is universal among all children. That requires you to adopt the toy's point of view, the He-Man's point of view, or some such thing, right? And you can't do that without the mirror neuron system. Because as I said, it allows you to put yourself in the other person's shoes and look at the world from the other person's point of view and read the other person's mind. So their lack of empathy, poverty of language skills, poverty of imitation, lack of pretend play, and all of that beautifully match properties of mirror neurons. So I think it's the best explanation that is available. But, sorry, again, what was your question?
Well, why?
Okay, why is it increasing?
Why does it appear to be increasing?
Okay.
I mean, there's a big debate about whether it is or it isn't.
Sure.
What is your view on that?
My answer would be, so that's the point I was trying to make. There is two aspects to it. One, what is a brain deficit? The second question is, what causes that brain deficit in the first place?
Right.
If there is a mirror neuron deficiency, what's causing it? Is it heavy metal poisoning? Is it vaccines? Or is it something else?
Oh, okay, right.
So it could be that those factors are increasing and therefore affecting the mirror neuron system. But what I'm interested in is the immediate cause of the symptoms, what's changed in the brain, rather than what causes the change in the mirror neuron system.
Oh, I see. So you're not suggesting that these people are necessarily born with a deficit.
No.
It could be an environmental.
It could be an environmental, or they could be born with a propensity to acquire that environmental. I mean, it's complicated.
Yes, yes.
It could even be a viral infection, but they probably lack the immune mechanism for defending themselves against that virus. So it's just a complicated interaction between nature and nurture, as always.
Yes. And obviously it's becoming a huge societal problem because it does seem to be increasing, or at
Well,
least...
I should point out, by the way, with regard to the mirror neuron system, our evidence, and also evidence from UCLA, from Jacoboni and others, shows the mirror neuron deficit using functional brain imaging. There's one group who claims that the mirror neuron system seems to be intact, so there's still a debate going on about this. But remember, even if the mirror neuron system itself is intact, the zones in the brain to which it projects could be deficient. The connections may be deficient, so it doesn't, not necessarily damaging to the theory if you find the mirror neurons themselves are intact. But it's still early days to say that we know for sure that autism is caused by mirror neuron deficit. It just seems very plausible looking at all the evidence.
And if it proved to be so, does it lead to any potential treatments?
Well, as I said, then it harks back to your earlier question, can you exercise the mirror neuron
Yes.
system? Could it be, for example, there's some residual activity still there, it's not gone completely? If so, can you use biofeedback? We know, for example, there's a phenomenon called EEG, mu wave suppression, which happens when I watch you. And this is because we think it is reflecting mirror neuron activity in the brain, right? So and autistic children have less mu wave suppression, but can they watch their own mu wave signal in the screen and through biofeedback learn to enhance their mu wave activity, thereby relieve the symptoms of autism? This is being tried as we speak. I don't know the answer yet. So you could enhance the activity, exercise them by using biofeedback. Now, whether you can use mirrors, whether you can use other procedures, imitating other people, all that, we don't know yet. But in that sense, it might pave a way for discovering new treatments.
Has anybody, your group or related groups, looked into the potential effects of things like meditation on whether that affects the mirror neuron system?
No, I haven't, but I have heard of such a study, but not my group, and I'm afraid I'm blocking, I don't remember exactly what they found.
Yes. Which leads me into a bigger question that I wanted to ask you, Rama. You are Indian, and you do seem to have a tremendously holistic approach to science.
Yeah.
Do you feel in any way that that has been informed by where you come from and the tradition you grew up in?
People often ask me that, and I think my interest in consciousness and self partly may have something to do with my Indian background, but there are a lot of non-Indians who are interested in consciousness. In fact, I would say half the population here is interested in consciousness and self, and most of them are American, not Indian. So it's easy for me to say it's because I was raised as an Indian, but I don't, maybe not, maybe. See, I got interested in this when I looked at patients with neurological syndromes, where the problems arise of representation of self and disturbed consciousness. All of these questions about human nature arise. So you cannot not be interested in the brain and in consciousness. If you're a human being seeing a patient, neurological patient in the ward, all these questions, philosophical questions, come up spontaneously, and you become interested. I think that's what happened, rather than my being Indian.
You made a point earlier on, repeatedly, that some of these anomalous things that you discover have been repeatedly pushed under the carpet by the mainstream because they didn't fit with the prevailing views. But a lot of your work also, and you make this point beautifully in your book, is about doing experiments that are, as you put it, very low tech, that your discovery about phantom limbs and how to treat it was made with a glass of water, some Q-tips, and a couple of ordinary mirrors. This is not brain scanning or gene sequencing machines. You are an incredible example that great science can be done with the simplest of tools. this does seem to buck the trend of our time, where getting the machinery seems to be high on the list of a lot of scientists' priorities. What has driven you to go for this small-scale science approach?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one is I used to read a lot about history of science when I was an undergraduate student. And the elegance and simplicity of the great experiments in science, like Faraday, just, you know, he wanted to show that there are fields. People didn't know how do you show for sure that there's such a thing as a field. It's a mathematical abstraction.
Sorry, he means magnetic fields here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, magnetic fields, yeah. Yeah, not... So all he does is take a bar magnet, puts it behind a sheet of paper and sprinkles iron filings. And nothing can be simpler than that. Demonstrated, my God, there are such things as fields. You can literally see them, right? I mean, any school child can do this experiment. Or he takes a magnet and then bar magnet, and he moves it in a coil and he generates a current, thereby linking two seemingly unrelated fields of physics, electricity, and you're writing a book on physics, so electricity and magnetism, which people didn't know were related. And of course, Galileo's famous experiment of, you know, dropping, people believed that this bigger, heavier stone will fall on the ground first for 2,000 years. Why? Because Aristotle said so. I mean, any fool could have gone up a tower and dropped 2 stones. But, I mean, any school child could have done this, but nobody did, because they said Aristotle already knew. But Galileo said, let me take 10 minutes and actually try and do it. You know? And actually he got tenure for that, apparently. So if you look at the history of science, I don't think students these days read enough about the history of science. All the great experiments have often been extremely simple. The other reason I do simple experiments is I'm lazy.
It's hard to believe, Rama.
Well, I mean, you know, learning complicated techniques takes years. And I don't mean that entirely facetiously. Partly it's true. Thirdly, I think that using simple experiments forces you to be more ingenious. If you have a big fancy machine, it's like if you take a 6-year-old and give him a knife, he start cutting everything. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, it's like if you give him a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. So a lot of my colleagues do this with fancy brain imaging techniques. Now, I don't want to be a Luddite. Obviously, brain imaging has transformed the field. But 90% of what you see is like the little kid with a knife, cutting everything in sight. So that's another reason for picking simple techniques. So there's aesthetic elegance, there's laziness, and then there is the fact that it forces you to think more.
Your arguments are incredibly persuasive. Do they work with your students?
I hope so.
I mean,
it does rub off. I mean, I think that a lot of the time my own scientific thinking and style has been based on emulation. I think it's very important to pick professors or mentors who are, first of all, very passionate about what they do, because boredom is contagious too. But so is passion. It's contagious. Yes. And people who have got this large vision, broad vision, and tell you about stories about history of science, there are not that many people who do that. And it's important to latch on to such people. And I had the good fortune to do that many times in my career. So I hope some of my students it's rubbed off on, but I'm not sure. Wait and see.
I think it's an incredibly important point that you're making, that knowing something about the history of science really does affect how you see and do science today. And it's one of the things that I've argued a lot in my career. But many scientists are so acculturated now that it's the future we have to look to, that there's nothing to be learned from the past because we've transcended all of that. And I think it is a very big problem in some fields, particularly physics, and it sounds like from what you're saying, neuroscience, that people expect that the new important discoveries will come through the new and important technologies.
Well, even if that's true, I think that there are 2 reasons for looking at the history. First of all, it makes a subject come to life. It makes it much more fun because you see yourself as part of this great story. So that's one reason. The other reason is you learn from the masters. You know, you emulate. You look at them. You said, "How did he think of that experiment? What did he do? Oh my God, it's that simple. He took that shortcut." This sort of. So you read about these experiments. That also influences the way your style of thinking, in many different ways. So there are 2 reasons for doing it, and it's a pity that a lot of people don't. And think that you have to only be forward-looking and shouldn't look at the history.
And I think you were sort of alluding to this point earlier in your presentation, that an obsession with the big machines can cause people simply not to see the very simple things that can be done, and to miss incredible insights that you've made with very powerful but very, very simple tools that could have easily been overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but one of the classic examples which I tell my students, you go to Florence, the Museum of Science. I don't know if you've been there. There's a huge big room with an enormous device full of pulleys and levers and gears and all of that. And its whole purpose is to locate planetary orbits and measure, compute planetary motion. This is it's based on the Ptolemaic system of epicycles. An extraordinarily complex thing, but doesn't work. And right next to it is a much smaller room with a little pillow, with a little cushion, pillow, with a cardboard tube with 2 lenses in it. That was Galileo's original telescope. It's completely changed our conception of the universe.
Yeah.
So that's a good illustration of the point you're making.
Yes.
And you know, the Galileo story, which I'm sure everybody here knows about, I often tell my students, people think, oh, Galileo invented the telescope. Actually, that's not true. You know, as you probably know as a historian of science, it was used as a toy all over Europe, especially in France. Some optician, found that you took 2 lenses like this and you do that, you see things close up. And he said, my God, what a wonderful toy this would be. And he put it in a cardboard tube and started looking at neighbors and spying on people. This is very popular among children. And Galileo looked at this and I said, why spy on people? Why not just tilt it 45 degrees and look at the sky? That's all he did, tilted 45 degrees, right? I'm oversimplifying. He also had to grind the lenses, remove chromatic aberration and all of that stuff. But having done that, he looks at, first thing he does, he looks at the Milky Way. And he says, I'm sorry, we're going off track here, but he looks at the Milky Way and he says, my God, it's not a homogeneous cloud, it's made up of billions of little stars. It's the first time anybody had seen that. Imagine his thrill when he saw that, all with this cardboard tube. Then he looks at Jupiter, and he sees Jupiter, looks at Jupiter, and my God, and it's known as a wandering star at that time. And then he says another little spot appeared next to Jupiter, and then 2 little spots, and then 3 little spots, and then the spots start, I may get the details wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. Then the spots start disappearing sequentially. And he says, what's going on here? My God, Jupiter has moons, and they're orbiting Jupiter, they're going around Jupiter, and that's why they're temporarily occluded, and they reappear. This means that there are other Earth-like planets, and they have moons. This means the Earth cannot be the center of the universe, because here are moons that are going around Jupiter, not around Earth. So in one, with a cardboard tube and 2 lenses, he had disproved the Copernican, sorry, not the Copernican, the earlier view.
The Ptolemaic.
The Ptolemaic view of the universe. And then he looks at Venus and sees it's a crescent and it goes through the phases and all of that. Everything done with this cardboard tube and 2 lenses. So that's a lovely example of simplicity and elegance in science. I mean, one could go on for hours about this. Yes. Newton and the prism, but I won't.
I wanted to ask you, Rama.
Can I just pause for a second?
Yes, go. Yes.
Because I was just talking to my students the other day about what you mean by a crucial experiment. You can do all sorts of tangential experiments to prove a point. Waste months and months and years and years. What you need to do is what's the simplest experiment that crucially gets at that point? A best example I can think of is everybody thinks that Newton discovered that white light is made up of colors by putting a prism in front of a beam of white light and it's split up into 7 colors. Wrong. That was known years before Newton. People had chandeliers. That's why they had chandeliers, because they knew prisms produce colors with white light. But then when somebody put the light through the prism and showed that it split up into 7 colors, then somebody said, well, it's impurities in the glass, that's why it's colored. How can white light produce colors? So what they did was they started making more and more better quality prisms, removing the impurities. But however much they remove the impurities, somebody would always come along and say, yeah, but you're not made it completely pure, that's why it's producing these colors. This went on and on for decades. Newton said, forget about all this. He took a second prism and put it upside down, combined the colors and produced white light again. He said, if it's impurities, it should become even more colorful, right? So he did what's called, the phrase crucial experiment comes from Newton. So I tell my students, look, so he did the obvious experiment. How did he think of it? So think of, here's an experiment, apotemnophilia or Feynman. So don't go about beating around the bush. Find the one experiment that will prove your point. And so here again is a lesson from the history of science. That's a lovely example.
You seem to have a remarkable gift for finding such experiments, Rama.
Well,
do you think it can be learned?
I think it can be learned. I think,
what
as
are
I
the
said,
key points?
Well, I think that you can develop, you can always say it's an innate ability, but no way of getting around that. But I don't think it is. I think that you watch the masters and see how they do it. And then you read broadly, so your brain can make these links. And I think you should introduce, may sound frivolous, but you should introduce a lot of poetry in the school curriculum, because poetry also involves making seemingly unrelated links. And it's not adequately emphasized in schools. In fact, humanities in general, not adequately emphasized. And I think, also I think humor should be emphasized in schools. Because jokes also involve seeing unrelated connections and then laughing. So it's a very creative act. Joke and humor are very creative. And one hopes that if you learn a lot of jokes and a lot of poetry, that creativity will spill over into scientific creativity and imagination as well.
What a wonderful, wonderful point, Rama. I think that's fabulous. That seems like a wonderful entree to open up in general. We've only got one microphone in the house today, so what I'm going to do is choose this young woman here, and then the person in the blue shirt over that side. The blue?
Hi, thank you. First, I want to say I've loved your work, Rama. I watched all the Beyond Belief and just about everything, and my husband thinks that I have some form of synesthesia, but it's not the classic kind. And I'm wondering, is there a place either at your lab or somewhere at your school where I could be tested or find out more about that?
You want me to examine you? Well, yes. I mean, you can always email me or my students, David Brang, dbrang@ucsd.edu, who studied synesthesia. D. Brang, B-R-A-N-G, D as in Dr. Brang, B-R-A-N-G, dbrang @UCSD, University of California, San Diego, .edu. He studied synesthesia extensively. And there are many other types of synesthesia, not just number, color. What kind do you have, if I may ask?
I see all the letters when people talk, and
Oh. The time geography one is not so rare, it's a common one, and he's studying that. It's a fascinating form of synesthesia. And what the lady is referring to is some people see 5 is red, 6 is blue, and 7 is green or whatever. Some people, every time they see a number or they imagine a number, you and I can imagine a number, most of us, 1 to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly they're located left to right, the sequence. I mean, it's not very vivid, but there's a vague sense of going from left to right. These people see numbers in specific locations. So 5 is always here. And it's often 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It occupies a convoluted, elaborately convoluted line, often folding back on itself. This is called a number line. Same thing with months of the year, days of the week, and all of that. And nobody knows what causes it. It's a sort of number or calendar synesthesia. It's called a number location synesthesia or week location synesthesia. We think it has something to do with the way the brain represents space and sequential events like time or numbers, things like that. But we can go into it in detail later if you want.
So I want to come to that kind of a question of meditation again. That for people who have been long-term meditators, and this has been documented in texts going hundreds, thousands of years, they have similar experiences of being able to, say, suppress verbal thinking or have a different experience of time or a different experience of themselves spatially or a connection to some type of oneness, that kind of spiritual experience. Could an interpretation of that be that they, through this practice, have been able to purposely either favor certain cognitive functions over other functions? For example, like somehow enhance right brain over left brain functions, or to be able to purposely suppress certain cognitive functions. And would it be possible to develop that type of skills, and like theoretically some advanced meditative skill to do things like suppress synesthesia or something like that?
Or enhance mirror neurons, for
right,
example.
Through essentially self-effort, which seems also uniquely specialized to humans to be able to do that.
Well, these are very good questions, and I think it raises the whole issue of can you internally reorganize the brain in many ways? And there's a lovely book called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge, D-O-I-D-G-E, and it raises some of these issues. And my answer to this is absolutely yes, and it can be done. But the problem is there's very little investigation, serious scientific investigation of this. So what's going to happen is some of this is going to be, a lot of my colleagues would regard this as fringe, which is idiotic. I think some of it is going to be flawed, it's going to be fringe. But some of it is going to be genuine, it's going to be studied in a systematic way scientifically. Like meditation is now widely accepted as a perfectly valid phenomenon and extremely useful in many situations. But we don't clearly understand what's going on in the brain. That needs to happen. Once you understand how mirror neurons work, what is meditation doing in the brain, then you can start talking about applying it to reorganizing your own brain. So I know it's a very vague answer, but it's the best we can do now, given our state of knowledge.
That person up there, and then we'll have someone from this side. There's a woman over here.
I kind of hope this doesn't come out esoteric, but you talk a lot about the deficiencies in the brain, but I wonder about upper limits of the brain. What we have, for example, super geniuses or people who can remember every day of their life. Do you know what the upper limits of the brain are, and is there a way in the future to make superhumans who have all these abilities?
Well, it's kind of vaguely related to what this gentleman is asking. I mean, I can see a future where you enhance lots of brain activity, much higher level than what we have now. But there are evolutionary limits to what you can do. But you can say you can transcend those limits using genetic engineering. So it depends on exactly where you're coming from. Yeah, I'm sure you can enhance many of the abilities, but exactly what you mean by super, if you say supernatural, I'll say no, and I'm sure you would agree. But you're talking about extraordinary genius-like potential. Can you create that in a normal brain as opposed to somebody being born a genius? Well, there is a phenomenon, of course, of savant syndrome, but that's, again, innate. It's not something you acquire. I've seen patients who have left hemisphere damage who suddenly start writing poetry. There's one chap who had temporal lobe seizures, developed late onset temporal lobe seizures, suddenly started writing poetry. In fact, he wrote a poem about me and mailed it to me. It wasn't a very good poem, but it was still amazing given he didn't understand poetry, he couldn't write any poetry prior to the seizure. So these things can happen, but again, there's no systematic scientific study, and I can't give you an informed answer saying, yes, it's possible. Nor would I rule it out. Most of my colleagues would rule it out completely, but I wouldn't do that.
Rama, there's a guy in Australia, is it Alan Snyder,
Snyder, a good
who's
friend.
doing
Yes.
magnetic
Yeah,
stimulation.
I should have said that. There's a good friend and colleague of mine, Alan Schneider. He claims we've known for a long time that if you have strokes, sometimes it unmasks a latent skill or ability. You're slightly better at something. What Schneider claims is using transcranial magnetic stimulation, you can temporarily silence parts of the frontal lobes, either on the left or right side, and suddenly make somebody produce beautiful drawings or do arithmetic much more effectively than he could prior to the stimulation. So that's the only experiment I know of where somebody's actually tried this online and showed an enhancement of cognitive abilities as a result of stimulating specific parts of the brain.
Have you done it with him?
I'm sorry?
Have you tried his machine?
Yeah, that's why I'm so good. He did it on me. No, I haven't participated, nor I have collaborated with him, but
Right.
I've corresponded with him. And
You're not tempted? I would, as soon as I read about it.
saturated already.
Oh, I see.
No, I mean,
You're operating on so
I-
many fronts already.
I also worry about the technology, and
Yeah,
I've had it done to me before, but not to the extent that he does.
right. It's when he does this transcranial magnetic stimulation, some people suddenly blossom with these abilities of drawing and painting that they've never.
They're never outstanding, to be sure.
But they're a lot better than they were before.
Yes, they're better than they were, and they're sometimes passable, but they're not exactly.
Yeah.
They can do things like count up to 8 instead of 4 if you flash numbers on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
They do subitizing, it's called. So you flash up 5 little dots on the screen. So how many dots did I flash? Most people can only do it up to 7 or 8. These people can go up to 10 or 11.
Mm-hmm.
That's not exactly something to be proud of.
But some of them
But it does-
suddenly
it does
start
show that
drawing
it's
much more
positive.
fluidly,
Yeah.
which is the thing that astounded me. That seems like a very high-level skill to be
Yes.
affected by something like a magnetic field.
I don't know if that's been confirmed, that particular observation.
Oh, okay, that was,
The overall claim that some abilities are enhanced has been confirmed. But specifically whether you get beautiful drawings and things of that nature, those claims were made very early on, not by
Yes.
him, but other groups.
yes.
That's not, I don't think that stood up to scrutiny. But,
Oh, okay.
But still,
How
I think the
disappointing.
general point is very valid, and it's consistent with what this gentleman is saying. So So I'm glad you raised it.
There was this woman on this side, and then... Oh, that's fine. Yes, okay, we'll go. Yes.
Yes, great evening. Thank you both. For 33 years, I taught hearing impaired children, but at one point I had an autistic child in my room who was always looking at the sky and moving and so forth. And for some reason, a light bulb went on, and I gave him a magnifying glass, and then he started really focusing on everything. And from then, I was able to teach him the alphabet and writing, and then he went on with all the academic studies. And one beautiful morning, he would always arrive early at the school, as would this other student. And the cream on the icing on the cake was he went over and gave this person a hug. And to me, that was just world-changing. But when you talk about simple tools, this was a very simple tool that worked magic.
Good on you for being such a great teacher. This woman here has had her hand up for quite a long... we got this...
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you could comment or if you're
A
familiar
couple of people here too.
with any exercises that might help with disorganized thinking and schizophrenia.
I haven't personally worked on schizophrenia, and I think we don't know enough about the changes that are taking place in the brain, except neurochemically we know a great deal, but in terms of the internal logic of the schizophrenic brain and why they behave the way they do, we need to understand that much better if we're going to attempt to change their thinking or improve it. So the short answer is I'm not an expert in this field, and secondly, I don't think you can.
Yes,
How about in this corner here?
This
One of
guy.
you.
One, you're obviously together, whichever you decide between you, which one of you wants to have the question.
Would you comment on the deranged people that plague our society, like the tragic shooting in Tucson that killed a judge, a United States congressman with a bullet in their head, and killed a little 9-year-old girl? What do we do to protect ourselves?
Well, I can't answer the second question, but the first question, in terms of, gun control. Yeah.
Yay!
But in terms of the first question, in a normal human being, normal adult human being, there's frontal structures which are involved in such things as judgment, morality, respecting social values, things of that nature. And so this frontal dysfunction produces sociopathic tendencies, produces antisocial personality disorder. And that's what Damasio and others have explored this and shown that there are such changes going on in the brain. And once you've shown that, the next step is to try and find ways of fixing it. But they haven't done that yet. So I'm not saying we know for sure that this guy has that, but it could be there's a minor frontal dysfunction in his brain that caused him to engage in such activity. Yeah, sorry.
This lady here has had it.
I'm very curious about how what memory has to do with a lot of your studies. And for example, if David were asked to recall, have a facial memory of his mother, or if somebody who lost a limb was asked to remember running in the woods, or if somebody had their arm stroked and someone saw that and had that, the mirror cells, would that become a memory? If they saw someone else's arm being stroked, would that neurologically become a memory for them?
Well, the only answer I can give to that is we haven't specifically studied that in any great detail. But, for example, patients with phantom limbs will often say every time, so for example, one of my patients said he used to feel frostbite in his finger, in his phantom finger, during winter. And it turned out that he had had frostbites in that finger prior to his amputation. So there's a memory, lingering memory of that event, of that injury in his brain that persisted long after the arm was removed. So there are things of that nature we observed, but we haven't studied it in any great detail. Thank you.